The wind cut low through the basin that evening, carrying the sharp scent of burned sage and cold earth. My horse shifted under me as we reached the ridge, her ears twitching at a shape huddled near the cabin's ruined wall. It was too still to be an animal, but too thin to be a man. I eased my rifle from the scabbard, the leather creaking in the frost, and guided the mare closer. The roof was half gone, the porch tilting into the dirt, yet someone was inside. A glint of eyes caught the last light before vanishing into shadow. I didn't call out. Not yet. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to choose between turning away or stepping into the unknown. My name's Eli Barrett. I was born in the hill country back when the land was still more rock than fence line, the youngest of 4 boys on a patch of soil our father said was only worth keeping if you worked it till your hands split. We were raised on plain suppers early mornings, and the Sabbath spent in a clapboard church with windows that rattled in the wind. My mother believed in keeping your word and sharing what you had, even if it meant your own plate came up short. Those lessons stayed with me long after the war took my youth and a bullet took my stride. When the fighting ended, I came back with less than I'd left, with no stock, no savings, and no wife to greet me at the gate. Fever took her before I made it home. Then came the dust storm that claimed the child we never got to hold. After that, I didn't stay in one place long. I'd hire on for a season, mend fences, break horses, move on before the ground felt too much like mine. It was easier that way. By the time I came to Bitter Mesa, I wasn't looking to start over. The land was cheap because no one wanted it, fire-scorched hills, empty draws where the army had burned out camps chasing ghosts. Folks said the soil was cursed, but a man who isn't planting for the future doesn't fear blight. I paid a traveling broker $1 for the deed and rode out to see what I'd bought. The cabin sagged under a sky gone pale, with evening boards split and nails rusted. Part of the wall leaned like it meant to give way before the month was out. The wind moved through it, the way water moves through a sieve. I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under my boots, and put my hand to the door. The hinges gave a long, low cry as it opened, spilling the smell of ash and damp into the cold air. Inside, the light fell short of the far corner, but I could see enough the outline of a stove gone to rust, a table listing to one side and behind it, the shape I'd seen from the ridge. Whoever she was, she hadn't moved since I rode up. She sat wrapped in a strip of deerskin, knees drawn to her chest, bare feet dark with bruises. Her face was hollowed by hunger, but her eyes met mine steady, as if waiting for me to decide which way the night would go. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, the wind pressing at my back, the air between us heavy with questions neither of us asked. The cold inside that cabin was the kind that seemed to settle in your bones, even with the door shut behind me. My eyes adjusted slow to the dim, picking out the sag of the beams, the black mouth of the old stove, the tangle of broken chairs near the wall. She hadn't moved from where I'd first seen her, knees drawn up under the worn strip of deerskin hair hanging in dark knots against her cheeks. Her feet were bare, bruised along the edges, and her dress was little more than torn leather tied at the shoulder. She didn't speak, didn't try to rise, just watched me as if I was one more thing she'd have to endure before nightfall. I set my rifle against the frame and crouched slow, the pull in my bad leg making the motion stiff. From my saddlebag, I took out a wool blanket and laid it on the floor within her reach, then backed away without a word. Outside, the wind caught my coat and tugged at it as I walked to the mare. I untied a canvas sack and left it by the door, jerky cornmeal, a tin cup, and a match safe before heading toward the barn. The barn was no better than the cabin, half a roof, no door, and a drift of dead grass inside, but it was shelter enough for me. I spread my coat over a mound of straw in the corner and sat with my back to a post. Coyotes called somewhere out past the hills, and the boards rattled under each gust. Sleep came in short pieces, my hand never far from the rifle at my side. By morning, the blanket was gone from the step. Inside, the ashes in the hearth had been swept into a pile, the broken wood stacked, and the stove mouth left open as if ready for fire. She sat in the same corner, but now both blankets were wrapped around her, the deerskin in mine. I gave a single nod in her direction before stepping back out to cut wood. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting the basin in a thin wash of light, but the air still bit at the skin. Each crack of the axe was loud in the stillness, the sound carrying across the empty land. Now and then, I'd glance through the doorway. She hadn't moved much, just sat near the stove eyes following the flame when I lit it that evening. She didn't thank me, and I didn't expect her to. By the third day, she'd started brushing dust off the table near the hearth. It didn't seem like she cared about tidiness. More like her hands weren't made for idleness. Her movements were careful, conserving strength, and her eyes always came back to where I was working. That night I spent an hour cleaning out the chimney, scraping soot, patching cracks with mud, salvaging brick from the fallen wall. When I lit the fire again, the smoke pulled clean up and away. The next morning I found her by the fire, feeding it with small twigs. When I came in with a bundle of kindling, she lifted her hand to her chest, then to her mouth, before lowering it again. I figured her meaning quick enough and stepped outside to dig in the half-frozen clay, where an old root cellar had caved in. A slow seep of water pooled if you waited. I filled a dented pot and set it near the fire to warm, then poured some into her cup. She took it with both hands, fingers trembling more from weakness than fear. Later that day, I brought in a small crate from the barn. Odds and ends I'd carried for years without real use. A cracked bowl, a bent spoon, a sewing needle, and a wool shirt that had belonged to my wife before the fever. I set them by the door and left her to them. By the time I came back in that evening, she was wearing the shirt, the sleeves past her hands, and tied at the waist with a strip of leather. In the days that followed, she swept the floor with a broken broom she'd found, gathered bones and bits of ash from the corners, and kept to her side of the room during daylight. At night, she stayed wrapped in her blankets near the fire. Then, on the 7th night, her voice came low and rough. Tala. She didn't look at me when she said it, but I knew it was her name. I nodded once and gave mine in return. From then on, something small had shifted. She met my eyes more often, and once when I passed her a tin plate, her fingers brushed mine without pulling away. Still, she spoke little, and I didn't press her with questions. But one gray morning, with the sky heavy over the hills, I asked the one that had been sitting in my mind since I first saw her, "You got someone coming for you?" She paused in her work at the fire, set down the twig in her hand, and turned her head. "No." Her voice was quiet, but there was nothing uncertain in it. I gave a slow nod and let the matter rest. That afternoon, while clearing out the half-collapsed shed, I found a small tin box hidden under the floorboards. Inside were dried beans, a few musket rounds, a comb with 2 teeth missing, and a scrap of yellowed paper marked with a charcoal symbol. When I placed it on the table, she came forward and took it in both hands, gripping it tight. "I thought it was gone," she said almost to herself. "You know what it says?" I asked. She nodded once. "From my brother, before." She didn't finish the thought, and I didn't press her. That evening she ate a little more than usual, and when I banked the fire for the night, her hands were steady. The snow came light but steady the next day, clinging to the dry grass in thin bands. Inside, the air held the warmth better now that the roof was patched in places. Tala moved easier, though she still kept her words few. One evening, as she stirred the pot, she asked without looking up, "Why did you let me stay?" I sat back in the chair and ran my thumb over the seam of my coat. "Didn't see a reason to turn you out," I said. She nodded like she understood it wasn't charity, but something else. That night she laid her blanket near the door instead of the far corner, closer to the fire and closer to where I slept on the cot. I didn't remark on it, but I noticed. Morning brought the same cold wind, the same pale light on the mesa. But the space between us had narrowed. And though no rider had passed down that stretch of land since I'd arrived, I found myself checking the road less often. The wind had let up some by the second week, though the cold still clung to the ground each morning. Inside, the fire burned steady, and Tala had begun preparing meals without me asking. She measured out beans and cornmeal, like each handful was accounted for. Never wasting, always making sure there was enough left for the next day. I noticed she'd keep the larger share for me until one morning I pushed the plate back toward her. "You need more than I do," I said. She hesitated, then took it without a word. In those days we spoke little, but she had a way of moving that caught my attention when I wasn't meaning to look. She didn't startle easy, and she carried herself like she was always listening for something in the distance. Every motion seemed practiced hands quick when mending a tear steps light even on the warped boards. When she did speak, it was usually just a word or two. Once, as she was sweeping near the hearth, she murmured the name Sani. She didn't explain, and I didn't ask. One evening, the fire was low, and I was sitting at the table cleaning a rifle I hadn't used in months. She came over and sat beside me, not across the room or near the wall, close enough that her shoulder brushed my sleeve where the wool shirt had slipped. Outside, a coyote called, but neither of us moved. After a long moment, she asked, "What was her name?" I didn't have to ask who she meant. "Claire," I said. "Your wife?" she asked. I nodded. "She died here." "No," I told her. "We were out near Kansas then. Fever took her in the spring. Same year we buried our boy." Tala lowered her eyes to her hands. "I thought maybe I'd die in that cabin," she said quietly. "Didn't care much when I crawled in." I looked at her, then really looked. "How long were you in there?" "3 days," she said. "Before you came." She turned her head toward me, her face close now, lit by firelight and shadow. "You could have sent me away." "I could have," I answered. "Didn't want to." She searched my face. "Why not?" I shifted in my chair. Guess I knew what it looked like to have no place left. Her gaze held mine for a moment longer before she pulled the shirt tighter around her shoulders and leaned against my arm. She didn't move away, and I let the silence stretch between us. That night, she laid her blankets near the hearth instead of by the door, close enough that I could hear the even sound of her breathing. The next morning, she was already tending the fire when I woke. We shared breakfast without much talk, and later, while I was outside mending a corner post of the corral fence, she came out and stood beside me. "What are you fixing it for?" she asked. "Not sure," I admitted. "Just seems like it ought to stand." She nodded, then stepped closer. "I can help." I handed her the hammer without a word. She set the nails true, each strike clean, no wasted motion. "Where'd you learn that?" I asked after a while. "My uncle," she said, "before they sent me to live with the others. He said I needed to know how to build something so I wouldn't only be seen as something to take." I paused in my work, the rope in my hands going still for a moment before I tied it off. By the time the sun began to dip, the fence stood straight. It didn't hold anything in, but it marked the edge of what we had. We walked back together, our boots leaving 2 sets of tracks in the frost. Inside, she lit the lamp while I stirred the stew. I saw her stop by the small shelf where I kept a few things of Claire's, a brush, a folded handkerchief, a cracked mirror. She picked up the handkerchief and traced the stitching with her fingertips. "This hers?" I nodded. "You keep much?" "No," I said. "Just what stayed in the coat when I buried the rest." She set it back carefully. "She was lucky," she said. I frowned. "To die of fever? No," she answered, glancing at me. "To be loved that long." Later, when the fire had burned low, she came over barefoot, her hair loose, the light casting shadows over her collarbone and the curve of her shoulder. She sat close again, so close I could feel the warmth from her skin. You ever touch a woman since she asked her eyes on the flames? I kept my gaze on the rifle parts spread out on the table. No. She gave a small nod. I haven't been touched in kindness, she said. Not by a man. I set the cloth down, my hands still. Tala, I said, I'm not asking for pity. I'm just telling you what's real. I covered her hand with mine, rough palm over hers. I'd never take what isn't given. I know, she said. Then slow, she rested her head on my shoulder. That was all. No more words, no sudden shift, just the steady feel of her there beside me. When we lay down that night, it was together in the cot, her back against my chest, my arm resting around her. In the morning, we didn't speak about it. She rose first, as she always did, and stoked the fire while I pulled on my boots. The day started like any other, but the space between us had changed close now, in a way it hadn't been before. The wind had softened, though the air still carried a chill that clung to the cabin walls. By then Tala had taken to working alongside me in quiet ways, mending the torn lining in my coat, scrubbing the cooking pan, until it shone, folding one of my spare shirts and setting it neatly on the cot without saying anything about it. I noticed each of those things, though I didn't speak of them. That evening she poured warm water into a basin, dipped a cloth, and told me I should wash. I said I was fine, but she stepped closer anyway. Her hand rose slow, steady, and she wiped a streak of soot from my cheek, then another from my neck. I stood still while she worked, her eyes meeting mine just once, before she turned back to the basin. Later, she knelt near the fire, combing her fingers through her hair after washing with the leftover water. Her dress clung damp in places, the worn deerskin darkened where it had dried uneven. I could still see fading bruises on her shoulder, and the rawhide tie at her waist had loosened. I didn't stare, but I didn't look away either. I reached for the folded blanket she'd left me earlier in the day and offered it to her. You sleep in the bed tonight, I said. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly. And you? I'll take the floor or the barn if you'd rather. You don't have to. I know. She didn't argue, just gathered the blanket and lay on the cot. I spread my coat on the floor near the hearth. Her voice came from the shadows. I wasn't married. No man's coming for me. No one thinks I'm alive. I sat still for a moment, then told her she didn't have to say more. I want to, she said. She told me how she'd been caught near Silver Trace by a patrol held with others. The men were traded. Most of the women didn't make it far. She escaped when they stopped to camp outside Bitter Mesa. She'd walked until she saw the chimney and crawled into the cabin without caring if she lived. I didn't speak for a long while, just told her I was glad I came when I did. That night, she didn't stay in the cot. She lay down beside me on the floor, wrapped in the blanket I'd given her, and we both slept closer to warmth than we had in years. The next morning, I woke to find her still there, her hair spread across the blanket, her breathing slow and even. I rose carefully, not wanting to wake her. When she did stir, it was without alarm. She went about stoking the fire, and I stepped outside to bring in wood. There was a rhythm between us now, small, unspoken, but steady. I cooked breakfast while she sliced the potatoes. When I passed her a tin plate, her hand rested over mine just a moment longer than needed. That afternoon, I was outside working on the back fence when I heard her step up behind me. She didn't speak at first, just stood with her arms crossed, watching. What are you building it for? She asked finally. Not sure, I said. Just seems like it ought to stand. She nodded like she understood. Then she asked if she could help. I handed her the hammer, and she drove 2 nails into the sideboard with sharp, sure swings. Where'd you learn that? My uncle, she said. He wanted me to know how to build something so I wouldn't only be seen as something to take. My grip stilled on the rope I was tying before I went back to work. By sundown, the fence stood straight, nothing special to anyone but us. Inside, she lit the lamp while I stirred the stew. She wandered to the small shelf where I kept a few things of Claire's, a brush, a folded handkerchief, a cracked mirror. She picked up the handkerchief, tracing the hem. "This hers," I nodded. "You keep much?" "No. Just what stayed in the coat when I buried her things." Tala set it back carefully. "She was lucky," she said. I frowned. "To die of fever, no," she said, glancing at me. "To be loved that long?" Later, when the fire burned low, she came to sit beside me barefoot, her hair unbraided. The light caught the line of her collarbone and the curve of her shoulder. "You ever touch a woman since?" she asked. My jaw tightened slightly. "No." She nodded like she already knew. "I haven't been touched in kindness," she said. "Not by a man." I set the rifle aside and told her I'd never take what wasn't given. "I know," she said, and her hand came to rest on my chest, fingers light, almost unsure. I covered it with mine, not pulling her closer, but not letting go either. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed like that until the fire sank to embers. That night we lay together in the cot. There was no hurry in it, no words that needed saying. Just the steady warmth of two people who had decided in their own way not to be alone anymore. The days grew longer, the wind softer, and the snow that had clung to the scrub began to shrink back into the earth. Tala moved through the cabin like she had always known it, sweeping the hearth in the mornings, tending to the fire, rationing what we had without complaint. One afternoon, while I was checking the old chicken coop, she stepped outside wrapped in a borrowed shawl. "We should go into town," she said. I looked up from the hinge I was testing. "You sure?" She nodded. "We'll need seed if we're planting and cloth." I told her she didn't have to show herself, that I could go alone. "I know," she said. "But I want to go. I'm not hiding anymore." It was the first time she had spoken about her place here, like it was more than a shelter from the cold. The next morning, she braided her hair tight, tucking 2 feathers near the base. She still wore the deerskin dress, but I gave her my old duster to wear over it. It hung long on her, hid the bruises, and most of what prying eyes might search for. The ride into town was quiet. She sat behind me, her arms loose around my waist, her head resting between my shoulders. Graff's Hollow was no more than 2 dusty streets, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a boarding house. But it was full of eyes. I felt them on us as soon as we turned down the main road. Inside the store, I gathered what we needed: flour seed corn, a spool of thread, 2 bars of soap, and a small tin of salve for the last of her bruises. The shopkeeper's gaze drifted past me to her. "She yours?" he asked, a half sneer under his mustache. I looked at him flat. "She's with me." He said nothing more. Back outside, Tala's hand tightened on my sleeve while I tied the supplies to the saddle. "You all right?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She looked up at me. "They think I belong to someone." "You don't," I said. "You stay because you want to. Nobody owns you." She didn't answer, but her grip eased. That night back at the cabin, she stood at the window for a long time, watching the dark roll across the land. I sat against the wall, cleaning my knife. After a while, she turned. "I want something real," she said. I looked up from the blade. "What do you mean I don't want to just share blankets when it's cold? I want to know I belong somewhere, that I have a place that's mine." "You do," I told her. "Here." She stepped closer. "Say it." I stood, the words coming slow. "You're mine if you want to be. Not because I need something. Not out of pity. Just because I want you here every day, as long as you want to stay." She held my eyes, then leaned in and kissed me, slow, steady, certain. My hands found her waist, hers rested against my chest. We stayed like that for a long while, before moving to the cot, pressing close beneath the heavy quilt. There was no hesitation, No fear, just warmth shared, not seized. The land began to change with us. The ground softened, buds showing on the brittle brush, and the air no longer bit as hard in the mornings. We planted a strip along the east wall where the sun lingered, potatoes, beans, onions. Tala worked beside me, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with soil. That evening, she came out to the porch barefoot, holding something in her hands. "I fixed this," she said. It was the cracked mirror from the shelf, now framed in smooth wood she'd cut and sanded. She must have used boards from the broken shelf. Figured we could both stand to see ourselves clearer. She sat beside me and, after a moment, said, "I missed a moon." I set the chisel down. She looked at me calmly. "I've kept track since I was a girl. This one didn't come. You think I started?" "I don't know," she said, "but I feel different here." She touched her belly lightly. I asked if she was scared. "A little," she said, "but not of you." I took her hand. "If it's true, we'll build for 3. She looked down at our hands. I didn't think I could have that. A child, a home, a man who doesn't raise his voice. I told her she had it now. In the days after, she tired more easily. I fetched water, made sure she didn't carry too much, though she never complained. One afternoon, she sat on a wool blanket in the sun, mending a sleeve, her hand drifting to her stomach without thinking. "You sure you're ready to be a father again?" she asked. I set the feed sack down. "No," I said. "But I'll be here every day." That's what I didn't have back then. Time. This time I'll stay. That night she pressed her back into my chest beneath the blanket. "I was waiting to die when I came here," she said. "I know," I answered, "and now I don't want to leave." "Then don't," I told her. She turned in my arms, her forehead resting against mine. "I'm already yours," she said. "But I want to belong in name too." "What do you mean I want to be your wife? Not just the woman who shares your bed." I ran my hand along her jaw. "All right. We'll make it right." "In front of who?" she asked. "Doesn't need a preacher to mean something, just your word and mine." She smiled faintly. "Then I already said it, and I mean it." The next morning, she braided her hair neat feathers tucked behind her ear and wore the old white blouse she'd found in the trunk. It clung to her curves, the buttons mismatched. She didn't try to hide herself anymore. I stood on the porch, in my only good shirt sleeves rolled back. I took her hand, and we said nothing, just looked at each other in the morning light. That was enough. Spring came on slow but sure, the hard ground giving way to soft earth beneath our boots. The garden took green shoots, pushing up where we'd planted potatoes, beans, and squash. I built a fence around the plot, not to keep anything in, but to hold the wild back. Tala moved easier now, her belly rounding beneath her blouse, her skin warmed by the sun. Some days she rose slower, and some mornings she lingered on the porch, but she never let herself be still for long. When I tried to take a chore from her, she'd wave me off. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she'd say, the corner of her mouth just lifting. The cot we'd shared through the winter was replaced with a bed I built by hand, the frame sanded smooth and the joints tight. She stitched a mattress from burlap and feathers. It creaked when we lay down, and she said she liked that it made a sound, that it proved we were alive, not just ghosts moving through the rooms. I rode into town every couple of weeks for flour coffee and the other things we couldn't make or grow. Folks still looked at me sideways, but I didn't care. I had something to ride home to. One morning while I was mending a shutter, Tala stepped into the doorway, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. "I think it's a girl," she said. "I came down off the ladder." "You sure know?" she answered, "but I feel it. She's strong, kicks like she's trying to climb out already." I told her then she'd be like her mother. Tala came to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "Do you miss her?" she asked after a moment. "Claire," she nodded. Yeah, I said. I always will. But it's different now. I don't feel guilty for breathing anymore. The birth came before the sun one morning, sudden and sharp. Tala's pain came fast, her breathing tight between her teeth. I boiled water, laid blankets by the hearth, and kept my voice steady even when my chest tightened with worry. She gripped the bed frame until the first cry filled the cabin, a strong, clear cry that left no room for doubt. It was a girl. I wrapped her in the same wool blanket I'd given Tala the night we met and placed her in her mother's arms. Tala's hair clung to her damp brow, her chest rising slow but steady. "She's warm," she whispered. "We named her Naomi." It wasn't Apache, and it wasn't from my people either. It was just a name Tala spoke once and couldn't let go of. I agreed, without a word of argument. The weeks that followed passed in quiet work. The garden thrived, and the chickens we'd traded for in town scratched in the dirt near the fence. Some evenings Tala would hum soft tunes while she worked, the kind without words I could understand, but with a tone that told me they mattered to her. I'd sit on the porch with Naomi in the crook of my arm, while Tala walked barefoot through the dirt she'd planted, the light of the setting sun catching in her hair. We never filed papers, never called for a preacher. We had our vows already wordless, made in the daily giving of what we had to each other. The bed creaked under our weight at night, Naomi's basket close enough for me to reach from where I lay. When she woke, Tala's hands were quick to lift her, and mine followed to keep the fire alive so neither of them had to feel the cold. By late summer, Naomi was strong enough to grip my finger in her tiny hand, her eyes following the light from the window. The garden was heavy with food. I'd take my knife to the beans while Tala pulled squash from the vine, her belly now flat again, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. There was a peace in those days I'd never known before. No riders coming down the trail, no word from the outside to disturb the quiet. Still, I kept watch. Old habits don't leave easy. I'd scan the horizon now and again, listening to the wind for anything that didn't belong. And one evening, as the light stretched long over the mesa, I thought I saw a shadow pause just beyond the far ridge. It was near sundown when I saw it again. A figure just at the far ridge where the land dropped into the basin. This time it didn't move off quick. I kept Naomi in the crook of my arm while Tala stepped to the door, her eyes narrowing toward the line of shadow. We watched until the light faded and the ridge was empty. That night the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of wood smoke that didn't belong to our fire. The next morning I saddled the mare and rode the perimeter, taking the long way around the back slope. The tracks were there plain as day, a shod horse heavier set than mine heading in from the west and leaving the same way. I followed them a mile before turning back. When I reached the cabin, Tala was on the porch with Naomi wrapped against her. "They were here?" she asked. I nodded. Didn't come close, though. She didn't answer, just held Naomi a little tighter. Over the next week, we went about our work, but the quiet had a new weight to it. I still rode into town for supplies, keeping my visits short. No one said anything, but I caught a few looks from men leaning against the saloon rail. One afternoon on my way out, I passed a stranger watering his horse at the trough. Tall, broad in the shoulders, with a hat pulled low. He glanced at me once then, at the trail leading east, before looking away. I didn't recognize him, but the way he watched the road stayed with me. Back home, the garden kept us busy. Tala's hands were in the dirt, pulling weeds and checking the beans, while I mended a section of the fence the wind had pushed loose. Naomi lay in a basket near the porch, swatting at the air with her small fists. Every so often, Tala's gaze would lift toward the horizon. We didn't talk about it, but I knew we were both looking for the same thing. One evening, just as the sun touched the mesa, hoofbeats sounded on the hardpan. I stepped out with my rifle resting easy in my hands. A lone rider came into view, a man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by his brim. He stopped a good 20 feet from the porch. "You, Eli Barrett," he called. "Who's asking?" I said. He shifted in the saddle. "Name's Luther Briggs. I'm looking for someone. Apache woman, mid-20s. Goes by Tala." I felt Tala step into the doorway behind me. "You found her," I said. "What's your business?" Briggs glanced past me toward her. "Family's been wondering if she made it out." I told him I'd see if it was true. Tala's voice came from just over my shoulder. "They aren't my family anymore." He looked at her a long moment, then back at me. "If that's how it is, I'll ride out in the morning." He turned his horse without another word, heading toward the ridge. We watched him until he was no more than a speck in the fading light. That night, Tala sat by the fire, holding Naomi, her expression unreadable. "He's not the one who hurt me," she said finally. "But he knows the ones who did." I nodded, waiting. "They won't come," she said, more to herself than to me. "They already think I'm gone." Still, I kept my rifle close and my eyes on the trail. The air had shifted again, and though the land was quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished yet. By the next morning, Luther Briggs was gone, leaving only a faint line of hoofprints cutting across the frost-dusted ground. The ridge stood quiet again, the kind of stillness that settles deep into the bones. Tala moved about the cabin with Naomi in her arms, the child's small laugh rising and falling against the creak of the floorboards. I split wood out back the steady rhythm, easing a tension I hadn't known I'd been carrying. Winter gave way to the pale green of early spring. The land softened, streams running fuller, the wind carrying the scent of new grass. We planted beans and squash in the tilled patch behind the cabin. Tala sang under her breath as she worked Naomi bundled in a blanket beside her basket. There were no more riders on the ridge, no unfamiliar hoofprints by the creek. Whatever tie the past had tried to throw around her had been cut clean. One evening we sat on the porch with mugs of coffee watching the last light spill over the mesa. Naomi slept between us in her cradle. Tala turned to me, her voice low. "I used to think family was just blood," she said. "But I see it different now. It's who stays, who chooses to stand with you when the ground shifts." I nodded, the lantern light catching in her eyes. That summer we rode into town for the church social. Folks greeted us, easy, no sideways looks, just smiles and a place at the table. Naomi was passed from one pair of gentle hands to another. For the first time since that bitter winter, I felt the weight of watching eyes lift. When the evening cooled, we headed home along the dark trail, the stars bright and close overhead. Naomi slept against Tala's shoulder. The cabin came into view, lantern light glowing in the window like a quiet promise. I knew the road ahead would hold its share of storms and lean years. But I also knew this, whatever came, we'd face it as we had before. Together, under the same roof, with the same steady fire. Out here, the land teaches you to keep what matters close and let the rest blow off with the dust. And if this story finds its way to you, maybe you'll carry that with you too. If it did, well, you know what to do. Pass it along so someone else might find a little light in it.